Welcome back everybody to another episode of Cancelled Horror Games, a series where I look at interesting horror games that were cancelled for one reason or another. In this video, I'm going to take a look at a game called Game of Death, a psychological horror / action game which was in development by German team Burns Entertainment Software in 2001. Out of all the games I've covered in this series, that being one, as this is only my second episode, but shh, don't say anything about that, Game of Death sounds like the most interesting game I've ever heard. Maybe because I am a fan of true crime, but holy shit, check out this premise. You will control a young man who was taken to hospital after a brutal car accident that left him critically injured. But instead of finally getting the chance to wander off this mortal coil, he dreams of a world that seems to be inhabited by lots of serial killers. So basically, it is America from the 60s to the 80s. The goal of the player, who is skinless and looks like the guy living in the basement in Hellraiser, is they need to kill all of the serial killers in order to survive. This game would play like Shadow Man, a game I own but I've never played, so there you go, I don't know what you really can do with that bit of information. But anyway, straight off the bat, that is a fucking cool premise. The trailer for the game also shows John Wayne Gacy in his Pogo the Clown makeup. The player character sneaks in and some really rigid animations ensue. But they successfully released Gacy's still alive victims who are under the floorboards. Though Gacy's victims were actually dead when they were put under his floorboards, and yes, I am obsessed with true crime, and yes, my mother supports this hobby. After the victims are freed, they drag Gacy under the floorboards and the player character jumps in as well, and the trailer goes bye bye, ended, finished. But where this game gets interesting is how the player would have killed the serial killers. This ain't no GTA shit, this ain't no Doom shit, you can't just go in there and fuck these guys up. The serial killers are invincible, and in order to give them a little taste of their own medicine, you have to do the most badass thing of all: research. The player would need to read case files on the serial killers, find clues about how they kill people and why. Did they like strangulation? Maybe they like crucifying people. You need to find this out, because when you do, you find out their weaknesses. Each killer would have to be killed by the player using their preferred method of killing. I said kill a lot in that sentence, and to be honest, you're going to hear me say kill a lot throughout this whole video, so just be prepared. So if someone likes cutting people into tiny little pieces, you would need to do the same in order to kill them. Any other method wouldn't work. But the player couldn't just go all Dexter on their asses. They would need to be careful because you would run into the risk of becoming a murderer yourself, which, yeah, the player would be doing a lot of murder, so that whole moral dilemma thing would seem to be out the window, but you would need to make sure that you would only kill these serial killers under special circumstances, examples of which would be self-defense or when releasing their victims. Executing the killers this way would allow the player to keep their innocence, otherwise the player would die at the end of the game. So the moral of the story is, if you are in a brutal car accident and transported to a world where you need to murder serial killers, make sure you do so in an innocent way. That is what the doctor prescribes, so just pop a couple of killers in the head and you'll be back to work by Monday. The game would have had more than 40 killers the player would have to fight, and each would have their own level, which would be accessed through the most metal hub zone of all time, a giant bone cathedral. An interview of the developers discussed how Game of Death would have been different from other titles at the time. Quote, most action games are in fictitious worlds. The players fight against fantasy monsters or anonymous mercenaries. In Game of Death, however, the player encounters negative characters in contemporary history who are firmly rooted in the memory of their nations. Many Germans know Fritz Hamann, and many Americans know who Charles Manson or Jeffrey Dahmer is. Dealing with the abysses of the human psyche is exciting for most people, whether they admit it publicly or prefer to watch The Silence of the Lambs at home alone, and we are openly dealing with that. Another difference is the awareness of physical decay. The hero is not a Superman. If he is injured, the player can actually see the consequences of the injury. The hero loses physical substance with each injury until he becomes disabled as a skeleton. Of course, he can regenerate his energy and his physical substance during the game in various ways. End quote. The developer also elaborated on exactly how the real-life serial killers would have been implemented in the game. Quote, in the game, every mass murderer and serial killer dies according to the method with which he has killed his victims. As a result, the player becomes a hero and avenger on behalf of the defenseless victims. In order to fulfill this role, the player learns the most important information about the killer's deeds and psyche in a serial killer's dictionary, which is constantly available as an inventory component. Not every detail of the life of mentally disturbed child molesters is spread in it. The SDK limits itself to key data relevant to the game. The historically accurate course of the murders is not reconstructed in the game. This is not necessarily for the gameplay. I also do not think anyone is really interested in slicing up the guts of a highly pregnant woman like the Manson gang did with Sharon Tate. That's where we set very clear limits." End quote. The cool as fuck concept of this game and the characters was conceived by German horror writer and director, and here I go again butchering another name, Jörg Bergerud. He is most famously known for horror films such as Necromantic 1 and 2, Des King, and Shram. The only film I have heard that he did is Shram, which is about a serial killer. So this game sounds as though it was in good hands because it was created by someone who was familiar with not only creating horror films, but serial killer films as well. There isn't much information about why the games were cancelled, but the general consensus is that it could not find a publisher because of the game's subject matter. You know, serial killers and stuff. I don't know about you, but this game sounds super kid friendly because it teaches them an important lesson. Don't be killed by serial killers. And that is all we really know about Game of Death. Honestly, this game sounded so fucking cool. I've always wanted to play a game that focused on serial killers, and Game of Death sounded like it would have scratched that itch for me. An itch not many people would understand considering my fascination with serial killers, but goddamn does it need to be scratched. The public's fascination with true crime has skyrocketed thanks to the rise of podcasts such as Serial and The Last Podcast on the Left, and documentaries and films based on killers such as Ted Bundy or the series Mindhunters. So now would be the perfect time for a title such as Game of Death to come out under the floorboards and show us a rope trick. And that's it for this episode of Cancelled Horror Games. If you liked it, do all the YouTube crap, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you next time.